Thank you so much for having me here. And yes, like most people here, I'm wearing multiple hats. So now I'm going to be wearing the funny hat with a lot of antennas on, as well as my academic hat. So I've been asked to introduce transhumanism. The word has come up already in the word cloud we started with, but could one give a perspective on what that concept means? What that might be as a relevant concept for thinking about the neurotechnologies we have been discussing and the potential for humanity. So one way of defining transhumanism is to say it's a continuation of a classic humanistic project of improving the human condition. So the classical humanists realize that humans matter, and there are aspects of human condition that are not good, and we can probably improve them. So that was typically seen as a matter of education, liberal arts, by developing rational institutions, later on adding Enlightenment ideas about a just society and institutions. Transhumanists take up that idea and said, yes, but there is also a lot of parts of the human condition that we might need to improve technologically. Our lifespans are too short compared to our life projects. Our minds are too limited compared to the problems we're facing both collectively in the world and maybe the problems we have in our life. Maybe we could feel new things. Maybe we could become other things that are not quite human, but might be transhuman or post-human. And this would be a good thing. That doesn't mean all transhumanists agree on what a good thing is. There is quite lively debate about that. In many ways, this actually goes back to the roots of classical humanism. Pico della Mirandola, in his text, An Oration on the Dignity of Man, where he argued that God had given every species particular properties. The lion was brave, fishes can survive underwater, but God gave humans this special ability to change themselves. That is the unique, special property that makes us human and gives us that dignity. The rest of that essay is mostly about, and this is why Christians can do alchemy and Kabbalah, which was kind of a nanotechnology of the era. But that thing is at the root of humanism, and this is, of course, a core idea of transhumanism. It's a very human desire to try to become better, to try to fix the things that ails us. Now, one can also think about it as we want to explore other states of being, explore the post-human realm. Just like there are very good mental states, very good forms of life available to us humans if we're lucky, there might be even better ones out there in the larger space of possible future humanities. And we should be exploring that cautiously and perhaps in different directions, because it's not entirely clear even how you go about exploring that. So we have, over the past few days, quite often brought up ethics, and quite often it's been used in a way that I don't quite like. That is, somebody mentioned there are ethical questions here, and we rattle off some concerns, whether that is about liberty or autonomy, or whether it's about safety, or whether it's about anything. And it's usually treated as a kind of dampener, an inhibitor, something suggesting there is stuff we shouldn't be doing, which honestly is a big part of morality. We should abstain from a lot of bad behaviors. But there are also moral obligations to do good. There are good directions to go in. And I think ethics is very much about trying to figure that one out too, and push in that direction. So the transhumanist perspective is there are some forms of good enhancements, and we should be pushing for them, and we might even have an obligation to do that. Now, what kinds of enhancements are good is an interesting thing. So we're living, of course, in a world where the difference between therapy and enhancement is kind of blurred. We have a preventative medicine, which we normally don't see as particularly morally problematic, but it does involve changing ourselves so we're less likely to have illnesses that might otherwise be actually quite normal. We don't want to be normal, we want to be healthy. There are sports medicine where we use medicine to push the limits of what the human body can do, and also the limits of what's allowed by the somewhat arbitrary rules we decide for each sport. And we have, of course, things like cosmetic surgery, where we try to modify our bodies to fit our own or society's views on what's looking good. And vaccines are a beautiful example of a collective immune system, a collective technological immune system that we should be very thankful for. But of course, you can go beyond that. Most of us have been enhanced by having caffeine in our bodies, and it's binding to our adenosine receptors, keeping us a little bit more alert right now. And we don't regard that as particularly strange because it's part of our culture. Once upon a time it wasn't, and there have been many arguments about whether caffeine actually represents an imposition that is problematic. But there are other interesting enhancement drugs which, when used well, can improve performance on various tasks. Again, there are typically trade-offs. If I take an attention in an improving drug, my attention might be focused, which is great for finishing up a boring academic paper, but kind of dangerous if I'm out in traffic. If I want to learn something, this is something I always tell my students, I need to sleep well the night after having learned it so I can consolidate my memories. No stimulants before going to sleep before the exam. You want to have 8 hours of good sleep. Can we enhance that sleep? That might have an enormous effect on health, mood, etc. But it's of course possible to go much further. My friend Liz Parrish, she did do-it-yourself gene therapy to slow down some aspects of her aging by adding extra telomerase and myostatin. She seems to be doing fine right now. We're all cheering for her and might be hoping that this turns out to be safe and effective. My friend Todd Huffman, he's got an implanted magnet in his fingertip so he can sense magnetic fields. And this is interesting because most enhancements we talk about is about amplifying a human ability. But this is an extension, adding an entirely new ability. So I'm, from an ethical standpoint, a very strong advocate of what I call morphological freedom. So you can argue this in a traditional human rights framework, saying that we have a right to our own bodies. Nobody else might control our bodies. Similarly, we also have a right to our freedom. And together that seems to lead to a right to modify our bodies. This is, from an ethical standpoint, an interesting question, of course, how you motivate the rights, and we can get into a long conversation about that. But there is also an interesting issue of seeing this as both a positive and negative right. Generally, I think we should think of it as a negative right. Yes, I have a right to modify my body, and you're not really allowed to stop me from that. However, I can't demand that you support me in my silly ideas. A positive right might mean that we actually should have, on taxpayer expense, that the healthcare system provide those modifications. And there is an interesting debate here going on with the disability rights activists that often think that transhumanists are thinking too narrowly about just negative rights. We need positive rights to have environments that are suited for our different bodies, and the treatments that handle that bodies might be different. We see it, of course, very much in the current debate about trans rights. And there is an interesting question here, how far we want to push morphological freedom. Obviously, I'm running out of time, so I have a long, long list of ethical issues we can play around with. There are many interesting questions, like how do you do enhancement and retaining autonomy? How do we handle the safety things? After all, implanting a magnet in your fingertip is slightly risky. You might get an infection and lose your fingertip. That's negative. But maybe it's worth it. There are some people undergoing quite drastic body modifications for reasons that are not necessarily functional, but for identity, because they feel like, I want to be this person. So there is an interesting challenge to traditional medical ethics ideas here about how we judge safety. There are interesting questions about when is it appropriate for certain things. Should I be worried if my students are taking modafinil as a cognitive enhancer when studying, or should I be grateful that they're actually trying to learn something? Is it maybe more of a problem if we're taking it during the exam, because that's where we want to compare them? Or maybe we should say, actually the problem is the exams. Paul Erdős, the great mathematician, was on amphetamines for the last 20 years of his life and became more productive. Do we look down on the proofs he did there compared to the proofs he did in his youth? Or is it just that as long as we get those mathematical truths, we're pretty happy with it? There are also interesting issues here about competition and equality and access and fairness. But I think the really interesting question is that transhumanism is asking, what do we want humanity to become? And you quite often get very different answers. Most of us probably have an idea of ourselves as slightly improved, some kind of Greek, moving a little bit in the direction of the Greek gods. We're slightly more handsome and beautiful. We're living longer. Maybe we can fly and throw a bit of lightning. It's modest improvements, but it's still very much the human condition. Others are really dreaming about literally uploading themselves into computers. I am involved in a project looking at the technological feasibility of those kind of questions, or changing deep motivations, which might be very disturbing. Even though many people say, I don't want that, I think it's an interesting possibility that we might branch out in the future. I don't think the future of humanity is going to be one species. It's going to be that we become quite a lot of different ones. And I think that's good. I think that diversity strengthens us. We need different perspectives. It also means, of course, we need to figure out better forms of tolerance and how to run society where people have very different capabilities. But that's also something I think, for example, liberal democracy have been doing quite well. So I do think that the future of humanity is a rather diverse one. I think it's not going to be one, but many. A beautiful post-human Cambrian explosion of possibilities. Thank you.